Right. Now it's recording. So good morning, good time of the day for everybody. Now, today we have a pleasure of having Paul Jung giving our last seminar this year. Now, Paul is at KAIST. It's Korean Advanced Institute of Science and Technology. He did his PhD University of California, Los Angeles, had a number of visiting positions, and now he is full professor at KAIST. So it's our pleasure to have you as speaker today. For everybody else, as I just mentioned, if you have got any questions, you may wish to wait until the end of the talk or put them in the chat box. We'll be trying to monitor it and if appropriate, maybe to ask the speaker to comment during the talk. So the screen is yours, Paul. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Kostya, for the invitation, and also to Greg, my longtime friend and collaborator who initially invited me. And it's a pleasure to talk in this Probability Victoria seminar. Today, I want to talk about work on exchangeability, which is joint with a former student of mine, Jiho Lee, and colleagues Sam Staton, also at KAIST with me. So I'm going to start first by just giving you a brief history of exchangeability, just to warm everyone up. Exchangeability goes back over 100 years. The first theorem was proved by De Finetti in 1929 and extended in 1937, and was extended to a great extent by Hewitt and Savage about 20 years later. And since Hewitt and Savage, there have been many works. Notably, there was a lot of work on finite exchangeability by Diaconis and also by Diaconis and Friedman. So there was a series of papers by Diaconis by himself, and then also with together with Friedman. And then I think probably the modern theory of exchangeability essentially starts with David Aldous, who was motivated by a problem that Kingman had presented in one of his lectures. So while he was still a graduate student, he introduced the notion of partial exchangeability and proved a theorem which is now known today as the Aldous-Hoover theorem. And why Aldous-Hoover? Well, Hoover was actually a logician, but he got wind of the theorem and the proof of Aldous, and he realized that he could give a model theoretic proof, so sort of a logical proof of his theorem. And so he did that, and so there were two independent proofs, and actually Hoover extended the results of Aldous a bit, but today this theorem is known as Aldous-Hoover, and actually I'll tell you what that theorem is in just a bit. But this theorem has gotten a revival as of late because actually there's a deep connection with the topic of graphons and Zemuretti regularity, and many of you probably are familiar with what graphons are and what Zemuretti regularity is. And actually, it was noticed by Diaconis and Janssen in 2006 that the Aldous-Hoover theorem gives essentially a proof well, so Zemuretti regularity gives you a proof that essentially graphons are the limits of very large graphs. They're the compactification of very large graphs with some symmetry properties, and so Diaconis and Janssen noticed that actually the Aldous-Hoover theorem gives you this same proof. And actually this was independently noticed by Tim Austin, who was also a graduate student at the time. So Austin's done some work in exchangeability, and the topic I want to talk about is actually an extension of one work he did with Panchenko, which extended the Aldous-Hoover theorem to something they called hierarchical exchangeability. So this is if exchangeability uses permutation groups and products of permutation groups, then the hierarchical exchangeability uses Reith products of permutation groups. So I'm not going to explain. If you know what a Reith product is, then good. If not, it's not really too pertinent to the talk, but If you know what it is, it could be maybe helpful in understanding what that extension is. And our generalization is a further generalization of hierarchical exchangeability to something that we later noticed what also has an algebraic structure called a generalized Reith product. And this, there was some work done in the statistics literature by, I think it was by Terry Speed and various co-authors who used this generalized Reith product in actually applications in statistics. So, so anyways, in any case, this is the sort of structure of our theorem, and the motivation of that was of our theorem, which was in applications to probabilistic programming and some applications in Bayesian nonparametric statistics. Okay, so that's just an introduction, and now let me very briefly review Definiti's theorem for those of you that maybe haven't dealt with exchangeability in a long time. It's that we say that a sequence of random variables xi is exchangeable if when you have any permutation, it could be a finite permutation or even an infinite permutation on the natural numbers. So let sigma be such a permutation. If you permute the indices, then if the joint distribution remains invariant, we say that the sequence is exchangeable. So here you can think of these green balls as random variables, and then now we just permute them. And if such an action doesn't change the joint distribution, then we say that the sequence of random variables is exchangeable. So Definiti showed that if the sequence is exchangeable, then actually it's a mixture of IID. So what do I mean by mixture of IID? Oops, let me see, I'm trying to get the pointer. Okay, so here, this middle part is actually just a product measure, but so if mu is some fixed measure, then this would be the joint distribution of an IID sequence. But now suppose that mu itself is sort of a random distribution, and the randomness is given according to a distribution on distributions, which I wrote here as nu. Then this is what we call a mixture of distributions. So for instance, you could, so here, this is, maybe I should just write this down. So this is the IID sequence, and this is the random distribution. I'm not so good at using the stylus. And so some examples might be, this is not really working. So, okay, let me not use the stylus, and let me just say that some examples of this could be, for instance, if you had an IID sequence of Bernoullis, but let's say the probability of having a coin flip come up heads, P itself is random. Or let's say you have an IID sequence of normal random variables, and let's say sigma squared is random, the variance, or the mean mu is random. Then this could be an exchangeable sequence of random variables, and the mixture is given by the random variance or the random P or the random mu. Okay, so that's Definiti's theorem. And in order to state Aldous-Hoover theorem, I need to give you a slightly different version of Definiti's, which goes back to an easy lemma we all learn in graduate school, which is that any random variable can be thought of as being on the probability space 0, 1 with Lebesgue measure. So instead of using the abstract space omega fp, we can always take the distribution function and take sort of the inverse of this distribution function and just let x be essentially this inverse distribution function, and then this middle part here would be the probability space, and so this is the random variable. Okay, and so I think everyone knows this sort of representation, and so now what I'm going to do is use this representation to give you an alternate version of Definiti's theorem, which is actually due to Aldous. So this is the original form, and now what I want to do is use this function f. So here f again, you should think of this F as sort of the inverse distribution function. It's not working. Sorry. There we go. Inverse distribution function of some uniform random variable. And if the uniforms, if we have an IID sequence of uniforms as the argument of this inverse distribution function, then we have an IID sequence with the same distribution. And so here, the identically distributed part of IID is given by the fact that we use the same function for all of these representations.
Sorry, Paul.
But now, in order to get,
can you adjust the camera, please? We can't see.
Ah, sorry.
Thank
Okay. Yeah. Sorry, I kind of put my laptop down to write better, but this isn't really quite working. So in any case, maybe I'll just use the pointer. So what we want is now actually, we want to randomize F. So we can kind of think of this as having some argument omega inside. And if that's the case, then we actually have the random distribution for exchangeable sequence. So what I'll do is now actually add a randomness. So here, instead of omega, I'm going to call it U0 because, as I said already, we can think of any random variable as being on the probability space 0, 1 with some uniform random variable as sort of providing the randomness. So here, U0 is providing the randomness of the random distribution. Okay, so as you can see this bottom line. So U0 now controls the randomness of distribution. And so that actually causes, you can think of U0 as making this F random. So, so this is actually just an alternate form of definity, is to say that X is exchangeable if and only if there exists some measurable function F and an IID sequence of UIs and another independent U0 such that the exchangeable sequence has this representation. Okay, so these, I'll call these Finetti-type representations. Okay, so now with this sort of representation, we can now present the Aldous-Hoover theorem. And Aldous considered now arrays of random variables. And so we have a array, a two-dimensional infinite array indexed by n squared. And we say that this is separately exchangeable if we have that the joint distribution remains invariant under any permutation of the columns like this. So we permute all those random variables, and then we can also permute any rows, say like that. And if the joint distribution remains invariant under these actions, then we say that this is a separately exchangeable array of random variables. And if that's the case, then Aldous proved that there exists a representation, there exists a measurable function F and a family of IID uniforms, one uniform that controls kind of the overall random function. And once that's this, one uniform random variable for each row. So you can think of actually here, this is the fourth row. So U04 would control sort of this fourth row. So here, what I mean by control is it's the randomness that provides the random distribution of this row. And here, this is the randomness that provides the random distribution for this, this column and this row. And then here, this U00 can be used as a random distribution to provide the random distribution of these uniforms. Okay. Well, so they are uniform, but you can think that they were not a priori uniform. Actually, we can think of kind of breaking this function down into sort of these being some sort of random distributions, this being some sort of random distribution, and that determining those random distributions, and then these two determining sort of the distribution that would be there. And then we use U14 to actually finally choose the randomness at that spot. So, in like kind of the way I wrote here that U0 chooses or controls a random distribution, I'll just say for the rest of the talk that U0 controls, say, that sequence, and analogously, I'll say that here U04 controls this row, and U10 controls this row, and then U00 controls essentially the randomness of these guys. Okay, and that's what the Aldous-Hoover theorem says, is that there's a single F and this large family of independent uniforms like this, such that any separable exchangeable array can be represented like as such. So, as I said, one thing that Hoover did is he extended this, and in one direction he extended it is to higher dimensions. So one can also have three-dimensional arrays, and you can sort of permute the slabs like this, and you can permute, of course, you can permute this slab with this slab, and say this slab with that slab, and you can permute in all those different directions. And if that's the case, then the Aldous-Hoover theorem tells us that there exists another representation, again, a single measurable F and a large family of uniforms. So here, this will kind of control a row that comes out of one of these purple boxes. This uniform will control a row that comes out of these green boxes, and this orange would control, say, a column that sort of projects out of one of these orange boxes. And then once we see where this height, width, and depth meet up, then we have a particular UIJK, and then this will give us the actual randomness for the random variable there. But in addition to that, so that's essentially what we had from before. In addition to that, we actually have random variables that control essentially each slab. So this random variable will control sort of a two-dimensional slab like this. And this random variable will control a two-dimensional slab like this, and so on and so forth. And then finally, we have one single random variable at the very bottom in the corner that controls all the random variables here. Okay, and now we can kind of see how it would extend to higher dimensions. You can see that there are essentially 8 different types of uniforms, and one can roughly think of this uniform as corresponding to an empty set, this corresponding to the full set, these 3 uniforms as corresponding to any 2-point set, and these uniforms as corresponding to any 1-point set. So if we have a 3-dimensional array, we simply just have 2 to the 3rd types of uniforms corresponding to all the subsets of a 3-element set. So that 3-element set being the 3 different dimensions that we can go in. So is that clear? What the Aldous-Hoover representation would be? And now let me say one more thing, which is that actually in the Aldous-Hoover representation, we are actually restricting the types of permutations. So we are not allowing any permutation. So for instance, we can't take this random variable and then move it there, and then move it there, and this, and then say do some sort of cycle like that. Well, certainly we could do this if we want to, but we wouldn't have that the joint distribution remains invariant under this type of permutation. The only types of permutation that we guarantee that it remains invariant under, if it is separately exchangeable, is when we permute whole rows with other whole rows and whole columns with other whole columns. Now, if we actually said that we could do any sort of permutation along this array, then there's actually no reason to have this array structure. And one could actually simply just say, well, if any permutation of this whole family of green random variables is possible, for example, the one that I've drawn with these red arrows, then we might as well think of them as just a sequence of random variables, and we would just kind of revert to the Finetti representation. So the point is, when we have more structure, we actually need more uniforms to describe the actual additional structure that we have under this invariance. But when we allow for more permutational invariance, then in some sense we have less uniforms that we need. So here, if we allow for full permutational invariance of this array, then we simply just end up with a sequence, and we end up with Finetti. And this is going to be kind of a pervasive theme in the rest of the talk. Okay, so that's Aldous-Hoover. And now finally, let me get to the theorem of Austin-Panchenko. So what is hierarchical exchangeability? So what Austin and Panchenko did is somehow we want to think of the columns as being dependent on the rows. And what do I mean by dependent on the rows? In some sense, we actually free all the rows from their dependence of the column. So, so now we don't think of these three random variables as being tied together, because so I've gotten rid of that black line that connected them, because now the row is more important. And then what we really think of as columns are simply just these single random variables as being the columns. Okay, so these are just columns of height 1 now. So originally we had infinite columns of infinite height, but now what we're going to do is say each column is subjugated to the row that it's in. So each column actually is only a column of height 1. And in that case, what is the sort of invariance that we have? Well, if we have this sort of subjugation, what are the additional permutational freedoms that we allow for it? And so let me show you one example of that. So now here I've kind of released each of the random variables from knowing which column they're in, so which sort of big column they're in. And so now we can actually say, suppose that we have now invariance under these sorts of permutations, then what sort of representation theorem can we get? So here, notice I've switched these two, and I've switched, sorry, let me go back. So I switched these two, and then these two, and then these two. And this is not Aldous-Hoover separately exchangeable, because when I switched this and this, if it was Aldous-Hoover separately exchangeable, that means that I would have actually had to switch all of these with all of these. But on the other hand, since I switched these two, that means I would have had to switch all of these with all of these. Of course, we can't do both of those at the same time. Okay, so now suppose that we actually have invariance under the permutations that I just showed, then this is what we call hierarchically exchangeable. Okay, and if that's the case, then Austin and Panchenko showed that, so first of all, we can restructure this into a different picture. We can kind of think of this two-dimensional array more like a tree. Like, let me show that picture again. So we take this, and then we sort of think of these as emanating from this one vertex. And so we end up with more of a tree structure. And in that case, there is a representation proved by Austin and Panchenko, which, sorry, I didn't give it in this slide. I'll give it in the next, in a couple slides, but let me say that, so another way to think of hierarchically exchangeable is to say that actually the types of permutations that we're allowing for are any permutation that essentially gives us a graph automorphism of this tree of random variables that leaves the colors structure invariant. Okay, so we're allowed to say switch this whole family with this whole family, but we cannot say switch this random variable with this random variable, because if we did that, then there's no real graph automorphism that switches just this one random variable with this one random variable. So I'll show you a better example, a picture of what sort of exchangeability this definition gives us. But this is the definition of hierarchical exchangeable. It's that if the distribution is invariant under any graph automorphism that respects the colors of this graph. And the other thing that we can do with these trees is we can actually take multiple trees and we can take a product of these trees. So we can actually say, so we have, say, one tree. So this is sort of a two-dimensional array, and we can take all the random variables here, and we can actually take the direct products of this set of random variables with another set of random variables, which are the leaves of another tree. So we can cross this tree with this tree, and we get a four-dimensional array. So recall that each of these trees is a two-dimensional array. Okay, so there's a two-dimensional array, and this here is a two-dimensional array. And so when we cross them, what we get is a four-dimensional array, and which is indexed by n squared cross n squared. And now, if we cross two trees, then what are the sorts of permutations that we allow? Well, we can permute these big rows, these big orange rows. We can also permute small rows. And we can do the same thing with the columns. We can permute big columns and small columns. And then now, finally, let me get to now the representation that Austin and Panchenko proved, which is that there exists some measurable f, which, and the family of uniform IID uniforms, which are listed down here. Now notice this is a 4-dimensional array of random variables, but we don't have 16 different types of uniform random variables here. If we had an Aldous-Hoover representation here, we would expect to see 16 uniforms, but there are some missing. And I'll speak more to that in a second. But let me just describe some of these uniforms. So this uniform right here, which is a big column, sort of controls this yellow big column. This uniform random variable here controls a small column. This uniform random variable here controls a small column within a big row. And you can continue in that fashion, and you can kind of see which each of these uniforms controls. And notice that there is no uniform of the form 0J00. Well, what is that? That's just a small row. But the point is that if we have a uniform random variable that's here, then we have to know what family that it comes from. So if we have a J, then we have to know which I it comes from. So we don't have this, instead we have this, okay? And on the other hand, there in the same fashion, there's no small uniform random variable that corresponds to a small column, because if we know the small column, we also have to know the big column that it's in, and so on and so forth. Now, one thing I want to point out is actually, while this cross product of two trees is a nice generalization of these the Aldous-Hoover representation, it doesn't quite get exactly capture the structure that is pictured here. And the structure that's pictured here, in some sense, is sort of like a random block matrix. You can see that we have a sort of a very large matrix here, and then at each location of the matrix, we have a small matrix. And here, these dot dot dots mean that there's an infinite number of random variables in that square. But what we would like, if this is indeed a stochastic block model, or if this is say a block matrix, then what we would like it to see is sort of permutations. So we would like to see invariants that allows for permutations where we can permute this row with, say, this row. But notice that this orange random variable here, so sorry, I've kind of muddied the picture here with too much writing. So let me actually erase all this. Okay. All right. So so let me go back and say, actually, maybe it's best if I just show you the picture, the animation again. So here, notice that when we switch a row, we actually have to switch the whole row. Okay. So as you saw, when I switched this row, I had to switch this whole row with this whole row. I couldn't just switch this part with this part. I wouldn't necessarily have invariance of that type. But that's sort of a natural invariance that one would expect if we had, say, a stochastic block model or a block matrix of this type. And so I want to propose that, in fact, there is a type of exchangeability that corresponds to this. Okay, so if we allow for these types of permutations, then what is the additional structure that we have here? Well, in some sense, all these greens are sort of subjugated to this one orange. So we have all these small rows coming out from one of these oranges. But what we want is that these small rows somehow also know which large column that they're in. And as it is, what we're doing is we're taking the cross product of this guy with everything all together. So what we would like to do is actually take the cross product of these guys separately with these guys, and then separately with these guys. Okay, so we would kind of want another copy of this whole family. So what we would ideally want is just another copy here. And then this maybe would correspond to, say, this one, this family. Oops. This family here. whereas this family might correspond to this family here. So what we want to do is create some sort of structure like that. And I propose that actually the way to do this is to sort of subjugate the green random variables. So make a copy of them and then subjugate them each to a purple random variable like this. Okay, so I'm drawing all these extra arrows, and maybe it's not so clear what this means right now, but so one thing I've done here is actually I've now split the family of 4 into 2 families of 2, but here really these are actually infinite families. So these 2 random variables kind of should be thought of as my family of 4 before, and these 2 random variables and a sort of a copy of that family of 4 before. And what I'm doing now is saying these 2 go with this vertex here, and these 2 go with this vertex here. And so I've drawn a bunch of additional arrows to show sort of another subjugation. And if that subjugation holds, it turns out that, again, there is a representation. There's some measurable f and a large family of uniform random variables. But now we are missing, again, some extra additional uniforms that we would have had in the Aldous-Hoover. So here we no longer have uij00 because now when we know a j, not only do we know it's I, we also know it's L. Okay, so now not only do we know what orange it corresponds to, we also know which purple it corresponds to. So once we have the j, we're forced to have both the I and the k. So this sort of subsumes this random variable. We no longer have this type of random variable in the representation. And notice that I'm actually, as I've drawn more arrows, I'm actually allowing more permutations. And as I said in the beginning, when I allow for more and more permutations under which a whole array is invariant under, then I'm getting closer and closer to sort of the original Definetti, because I'm allowing for more and more permutations under which I have invariance. And if I allowed eventually for all the permutations, then eventually all the uniforms would just wipe out, and then I would just be left with a single one, and I would have a Definetti-type representation. Okay, so that's sort of holding with the theme that if we allow for more permutational invariance, then we actually have a simpler representation. Okay, so this is the sort of array that we considered, and I'm actually going to, so I think this was probably I've lost some people. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to kind of go through this again in a slightly different way to give a slightly different picture, which is to describe a summary finite DAG associated to each one of these structures. Okay, so the first one is very easy. If we have just a sequence of exchangeable random variables, so this is just Definetti's theorem, then my finite DAG is actually just a single random variable. And then from that single random variable, I think of all the infinite sequence of random variables coming out, and they are all exchangeable. Okay, so a 1-point vertex will be assigned to the Definetti theorem. Okay, so please bear with me, and I think people will start to see what I mean by this summary finite DAG. Okay, so the next finite DAG I want to describe is in the Aldous-Hoover theorem. It's just a 2-point vertex set. So if we have a 2-dimensional array, then we just take 2-point vertex set with no edges, and we simply take those 2 vertices and we emanate from each one of these a family of random variables, a family of green random variables here and a family of purple random variables, and then we just take the direct product of all these green and purple balls, and then we get this orange array of random variables. Okay, and that's the separately exchangeable array. Okay, so for Definetti, we associate it with a 1-point vertex, a single vertex, and with Aldous-Hoover for the 2-dimensional array, we assign a 2-point set, two vertices with no edges. And likewise, if it was a 3-dimensional Aldous-Hoover array, it would just be 3 vertices with no edges in between. Now let's go to the Austin and Panchenko setting. So the hierarchical exchangeability. So here again, let me remind you that the columns in some sense are subjugated to the rows. So I'm going to actually draw this subjugation by an arrow. So here, the finite DAG associated to a 2-dimensional hierarchical array is just two vertices with a single arrow in between them, a single directed edge in between them. So here, actually, I don't think I said this, but DAG stands for directed acyclic graph. Okay, so we're allowing for cycles, but not directed cycles. Okay, so so here we have two vertices and one edge in between them, and this edge is directed from one vertex to the other. And then now we always start from the top. So we start from sort of the top of the hierarchy. So this is the green vertex, and then we emanate all the vertices from the green. And then next we emanate all the vertices from the orange. And then that's how we get the structure that was sort of this hierarchical exchangeability that I described for this two-dimensional array. Now we can also take, remember, this is sort of like a tree structure. So we can take this tree and cross it with another tree, and then try to figure out, well, what is the finite DAG associated to that? Well, this is just one DAG. And then whenever we take just the cross product with another thing, so the direct product with another object, we simply just take a separate graph and we put it alongside it. So the finite DAG associated to the direct product of these two trees would just be this sort of simple DAG. And then now, finally, I want to now describe the DAG associated to the random stochastic block model. So with the sort of invariance that I described in this picture before, which was like this. And the finite DAG here is this, because now what we're doing is we're subjugating this green to this purple. And the way to think about it again is that originally we just had one sequence emanating from a single orange. But once we make it subjugated to this purple, we actually have now an infinite family. So we take a copy of this family, we make another copy, and then you take an infinitely many copies, one for each vertex that's here. So there are an infinite number of purple vertices. And so maybe this one corresponds to this purple vertex, and this family corresponds to this purple vertex, and this family corresponds to this purple vertex, and so on and so forth. So in some sense, really, all the greens that are emanating from a single orange should be indexed by n squared, because actually the greens are really being subjugated not only to the orange, but also to the purple. And so we can see that this guy is being, this family is sort of being indexed by n squared, all of its ancestors in this finite DAG. And the same thing goes for the blue copy of n there. And with this finite DAG, this is the sort of exchangeability that I had described before in the block model. Okay, so we can actually now draw any finite DAG that we want. We can, here's some examples. So then what is the sort of exchangeability that's given by these structures? So maybe I can go through these examples. So this one here, this is actually a three-dimensional array, but the way we want to think of it is actually a sequence of two-dimensional arrays. And each element of the sequence is sort of an infinite two-dimensional array. On the other hand, this here is an infinite array of sequences. So it's an infinite two-dimensional array, Aldous-Hoover array, but instead of in each spot we have a random variable, we actually have a sequence of random variables. Okay, so hopefully everyone can kind of see what the difference between those two structures is. The first is a sequence of arrays, and the second is an array of sequences. Here, this is, remember, our stochastic block model. So this is our block matrix. Then this is actually a sequence of block matrices by putting this one copy of n right above it. And this next one here, this is a stochastic block model, but instead of in each element of that stochastic block model having a random variable, we simply put a sequence there. And then finally, this one is a little bit complicated, so I don't want to describe this. I'm going to actually leave this as a question for you to ponder upon. And maybe if in the question period you can ask me about that last model. Okay, so so what is now the representation? Well, the representation depends on actually sort of, so in Aldous-Hoover, we have just now a set of, if it's a 6-dimensional array, we would just have 6 vertices, and then we would consider all the subsets that contain all those vertices. And what we do here now is if we have this finite DAG associated to our say 6-dimensional array, we consider all the subsets that sort of respect the hierarchy. So whenever we include a vertex, we want to include all its ancestors. So we can include here purple, and then we can also have a subset which is just blue, or we could have a subset that includes both blue and purple. But now the next subset, if we want to include black, because its ancestors are blue and purple, we have to include both blue and purple. And if we want to include white, we have to include purple. We don't have to include blue because blue is not an ancestor of white. On the other hand, we could certainly include blue because this sort of subset here still respects the hierarchy. Whenever we have a vertex, we include all its ancestors. And that subset satisfies that condition. And now, if we want to include white and black, we have to include blue and purple. If we want to include green, we have to include all the ones above it. And then, sorry, that's not green, that's gray. And then finally, if we want to include green, we can include green by itself, or we can include green together with any of the previous subsets that I've drawn before. And now this is a set of subsets that's not 2 to the 6th. It's actually a subset of 2 to the 6th. It's a subset that respected this hierarchy according to this finite DAG. And actually, these are the sorts of random variables that we actually include in the representation. So now finally, I get to our main result, which is that if we have a DAG exchangeable array, so if we have some structure which has a complicated graph like this, okay, so it's a complicated graph like this, and say that it is invariant with respect to all graph automorphisms that respect this color structure, then there is a representation of that array with a single measurable function, f, and the family of uniforms, and the uniforms are indexed by the sets which actually respect the hierarchy as I had in the previous slide. Okay, so we can go through an example for the random block matrix. If we have this finite DAG, then what are all the sets? So this would be the full set. This would be the empty set. This would be just the orange. This would be just the purple. And once we include green, we have to, once we include, I think we can actually just have the orange and the purple. This is the one that corresponds to orange and purple. And then once we include green, we have to include these two. And once we include blue, we have to include these two. Okay, so here we could have orange, purple. We could have both of them. That's the gray. We could have the green. Once we include the green vertex, we have to include orange and purple. And once we include the blue, we have to include its ancestors. And then we could have the full set. And that's the representation theorem that we have for these sort of more general exchangeable arrays. And thanks for your attention. And here's a picture of my collaborators. So I'll open it up for questions.
Thank you very much for your talk. Really interesting one. Now we have got time for questions. So if you have got a question, comment, please just unmute yourself and ask.
Can I ask probably a silly question? You can have two-dimensional arrays and demand that the array x sub ij, say, has the same distribution as x sub sigma of I, sigma of j, where it has to be, or you only require the same permutation of the row.
Yeah. Actually, it's not a silly question at all. That's there's an exchangeability corresponding to that. It's called joint exchangeability.
Okay.
Yeah.
And does that generalize in interesting ways, or?
It's actually it's quite difficult to generalize that, but let me just say that in the Aldous, so this is one of the extensions that Hoover did for just finite dimensional arrays. If you have something that has that sort of exchangeability, then instead of having a single, so I actually had a slide, but I wanted to keep it kind of short and not go so fast. I had a slide about jointed exchangeability, but let me just say that if you go to the Aldous-Hoover, the only difference now is that instead of having a UI and a UI0 and a U0J, what you would have is actually that this family of random variables comes from the same family. Okay, so you would have actually that this is really U1 and this is U4, and you would have a single sequence here instead of two different sequences. So you would have you would maybe just color these all orange, and then you would use the same permutation on the orange, the columns and the rows. And actually, this is actually a very important type of exchangeability because this is actually what the connection to graphons is.
Right.
You can probably see that if you have an adjacency matrix, then if you don't care what the labeling of the vertices is, then you would want this sort of permutation. Does that answer your question, Andrew?
I think so, yes. Thank you.
Thank you. Any further questions, please?
What does the proof of these things of this result look like? Is it kind of following the template of the Aldous-Hoover theorem, or is there something more involved?
Yeah, so it's quite involved. So there are some parts of the Aldous-Hoover theorem that you can use, but there's a so let me just say that even Austin and Panchenko's generalization is quite difficult to prove, and it's a tedious argument. So yes, there are elements that are similar to the Aldous's original proof, but there are definitely many new arguments needed. So one type of thing that you want to do is you kind of want to sort of use the invariance that you have to kind of permute all the random variables and sort of carve out the structure in some sense. And Aldous sort of does this. What he does is he sort of permutes all the random variables, and he kind of, because we have an infinite family, you can kind of permute them away to infinity. And then this is how he creates, so one way to do this is you permute them away to infinity, and then you actually get some sort of tail field. And that's how he actually gets these orange and these purple random variables. And it's sort of, that's one of the central ideas, is to sort of use all the permutational invariants you have and carve out the structure. But there are other arguments needed. For instance, Austin and Panchenko have a very complicated sort of induction, but the induction here is a bit tricky because you can't simply just add one vertex. So what one would want to do is, if you had a finite DAG, then add one vertex to that DAG. But then once you add one vertex to that DAG, you have to look at all its dependencies, all the arrows that are coming from it, and sort of make sure that you haven't messed up anything from before. And so I don't know if any of this makes sense. I didn't really want to get into the proof because in some sense it's hard to discuss it without getting into really heavy details. So I don't know if that top level argumentation makes any sense at all, but.
No, that's okay. I mean, the tail sigma field makes sense. I mean, that's how you identify the mixing measure and stuff like that. So.
Yeah. So that's actually how Aldous gets the orange and these purple in his representation, is he sort of permutes things to infinity and gets some sort of sigma field there.
Okay, thank you. Any further questions, comments?
I just wanted.
It's fine. Go ahead first.
Yes.
Okay, I just wondered if you could say something about the connection to probabilistic programming.
Oh, that's a question I would ask.
Okay, so the connection is, so you can kind of think of each node here in, let's take a general graph like this. You can kind of think of each node here as sort of doing some sort of computation, or maybe you get some sort of simulation. So here, maybe you produce a bunch of Gaussians, and then maybe here you produce a bunch of exponential random variables. And you're using these as some sort of samples. Or maybe you actually have a data set. And then actually, based off of this data and this data, you actually have some other data down here. And then these, this is a whole sequence of data that is based off of, say, you know, someone's movie preferences, and then also maybe someone's income, different people's income. And then you can kind of say something about the data points in this. And you can say, well, these data points only depend on this. And now you kind of want to say, you want to use some high level functions and be able to do some computations on this very large data set. And so you kind of want to know, where are all the dependencies? And that was the original question. And so how can we sort of reduce the structure of these big data sets? What depends on what ultimately, and is there some way we can represent, or is there a way that we can actually simplify the random, if we want to just produce a random sample, right? What's the simplest way to do that? So that was the question. So this was posed by, yeah, go ahead.
Does that lead to algorithms for finding stationary distributions of suitable Markov process that tell you something about the data? Is that the motivation for needing that kind of structure?
Sorry, I didn't quite understand.
Well, in Bayesian inference, in that kind of data, you want to find a stationary distribution of some Markov chain to tell you about the posterior distribution, right? So does the structure help you to structure the simulation that you need to do?
Maybe not from that. If you already have a Markov structure, then maybe you can just use that Markov structure. Right, but let's say you have some very high dimensional array of things that you want to produce random samples from, and there are a lot of dependencies. The question is, what is the simplest way to sample? But if you already have a Markov structure, then probably the Markov structure is the best way to go.
Okay. Thank you. Any further questions, perhaps? Right. Well, if there is no further questions, let's thank our speaker again. Thank you, Paul.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'm afraid this will be our last seminar this year. So Merry Christmas and seasonal greetings, as they say nowadays, to everybody. So please take care, and hope to see you next year, and we'll have our seminar series continued. So thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.